HeartEdge is an ecumenical movement for church renewal arising out of St. Martin-in-the-Fields in London, now on 4 continents globally, that believes renewal of the heart comes from the edge and seeks to catalyse kingdom communities through the 4 C's of commerce, culture, compassion, and congregational life. Since May 2020, we've been running a continuous festival of theology and practice, of which this monthly second Thursday conversation has been the flagship event. Check notices in the chat or on our website for how to get more involved, and do keep yourselves mute if that's okay. Today I'm delighted to welcome Brian McLaren. Brian McLaren is a prolific author and well-known speaker, synonymous with the emergent church movement. He's perhaps best described by the subtitle of his 2004 book, A Generous Orthodoxy, as a missional, evangelical, post-Protestant, liberal, conservative, mystical, poetic, biblical, charismatic, contemplative, fundamentalist, Calvinist, Anabaptist, Anglican, Methodist, Catholic, green, incarnational, depressed, yet hopeful, emergent, unfinished Christian. Brian and I will share a conversation for the next hour. If you'd like to join in, please put a question or comment in the chat, and I'll do my best to incorporate it. Brian, thank you so much for joining us. It's a real privilege to have you. You, no doubt, like everyone on this call, have been through a pandemic, which isn't yet over. Could you tell us a little bit about what you've learned in the course of the last 19 months?
Well, great. First, thanks so much, Sam, for having me, and to all the HeartEdge community, and thanks to all of you for being part of this. One thing I've learned is how privileged I am, in the sense that I have a home, I have a place to live, I'm financially stable, and I had the luxury of, during lockdown, not needing to go out and risk my life. And I think one of the things that I come out of these last couple of years feeling is just how unfair it is that some people have no choice but to have to get up and risk their lives every day to show up at the hospital or to show up at their job, and they don't have the luxury. Many of us thought of a lockdown as a terrible limitation, but then you realize what a privilege it is. So, and then being in a place where I'd have quick access to medication and vaccines and so on. And I just think, I guess one of the things I come out of this feeling all the more is how with privilege comes responsibility, and a sense of deepening responsibility. So that's one thing that I come out with. I'll tell you another, Sam, is that I think we've seen, and much more on my side of the Atlantic than yours, but I'm sure there are examples there too. We've seen how religion can really be sick and dysfunctional and problematic. And the Christian religion in particular, I think of all of the pastors who put their congregations in danger, all to make sure they had a crowd to adore them for another week, or some group of people to pass their offering plate to because they were in such a financial sort of slavery. And how many of them have fallen prey to conspiracy theories, just crazy, ignorant things. But there's some failure in our Christian faith to protect them from that kind of foolishness. The anti-science bias, all of this, you think people opposing Darwin for 150 years, you think, oh, well, that's too bad, but what harm does it do? But then you see at a time like this, when opposing science is deadly, what harm it does. And then, of course, you add to that everything we're going through this pandemic is in many ways a warm-up for the realities that climate change is facing us with. And so I come out of this period with an increased willingness to take risks and try to say what needs to be said within the Christian community, because we need a vital alternative to the kind of backward and destructive Christianity that's functioning out there in so many millions of hearts.
Can I pick up on that word responsibility? Because
Yeah.
um, I see it as a responsibility to the future. I mean, often
Yes.
responsibility is understood as a sort of loyalty to the past. But what I see in your work and your disposition is a great sense of, to use a phrase that I've used a lot and we've used a lot in HeartEdge, a future that's bigger than the past.
Yes.
Could you talk about? I mean, clearly, responsibility to the future is there in the climate emergency issue. That goes without saying. But I wonder if you could talk about responsibility to the future church,
Yes.
because
Yes.
clearly you perhaps well, you are synonymous with the future
Mhm.
church. So that's the obvious question to ask you.
Well, maybe I could start, Sam, by saying I think there's a really exciting theological dimension to this. Uh, we many of us will remember singing the hymn "Faith of Our Fathers," and this sense that faith was primarily about staying loyal to the past, uh, and that we had to keep saying what they said in the past and doing what they did in the past, and the sense of deep obligation being anchored to the past. But what that's done is it's made us highly irresponsible in relation to this loyalty to the future and this responsibility to the future. I think of the difference between this deeply entrenched nostalgia in the Christian faith. It's in Islam and Judaism. It shows up in many different faiths. But I think of the difference between this and the indigenous vision. I'm sure you've heard of here in my country, where many of our indigenous peoples said that their primary ethical directive is to think of the effect of their actions on 7 generations into the future. So this sense that I have an ethical obligation to my descendants, it's almost invisible. In fact, in a lot of Christianity, there's been this idea that Jesus is coming soon, the world's going to be destroyed, we'll all go to heaven, which further obliterates an obligation to the future. But in theology, starting with a theologian in Germany named Wolfhard Pannenberg and Jürgen Moltmann and many others in the decades since, there's been this shift to think about God instead of being, in a sense, God is in the past. He shoots off the Big Bang and we're being propelled into the future. This vision says, let's imagine God is in the future. God is the totality of good possibilities in the future. And God is sending us the present moment from the future. In other words, the future is the repository of time and it's flowing to us and it passes through us. And in every incoming moment of possibility, we have an option to choose what's better or choose what's worse, choose what's wise or what's foolish. And that theological vision, I think, is so liberating. The way I said in one of my books, it reverses the polarity of the universe. Instead of being driven from behind, we're being invited into the future. That theological shift, I think, could unleash some of the kind of responsibility that you're talking about. Does that make sense?
Yes, I mean, I often point out the difference between teleology, which is us planning a little bit like the indigenous peoples you're describing, us constructing a future from here into the future, and eschatology,
Yeah.
which comes towards us from the future, and what you're describing is an eschatological vision, and the phrase, the name of this series, Living God's Future Now, is very much derived from that kind of
Yes.
Moltmannian
Yes.
understanding that God's future is something that we anticipate. And in fact, it's almost a foundational notion of HeartEdge, that rather than the kind of notion of escape, the salvation as
Yes.
escape that you describe very vividly, that our calling as Christians is to live God's future now. That is, that's what being a Christian means in a sense. I
Yes.
wonder if you could talk about you. I imagine your life has been different in the last 18 months, because I associate with you with traveling, being a sort of
Yes.
itinerant across communities of hope and those
Yeah.
kinds of living God's future now communities. I wonder if, and my guess is you've probably zoomed into one or two of those, apart from us, in the course of the last 18 months, if I'm not mistaken. But if you could point to the kinds of Christian communities that you feel do represent living God's future now, that do represent
Yes.
that sense of a future that is an who are offering themselves to the wider church, and an example of what that
Yes.
actually often feels like.
Yeah, no one's really asked me that, Sam, and you're right. My life has been very different, and I have been so happy to not have to get on any airplanes. And everyone knows about Zoom fatigue, but I'll tell you, airport food fatigue is it has its problems too. So I've been so happy to be able to be with people in this format. The word that comes to my mind when you ask your question is the word edge, because what I'd say is hope is sprinkled everywhere, but it still, it seems to me, is an edge phenomenon, and so a spiritual leader like yourself and a congregation like yours can be articulating this, and one block down the street of this, or halfway across town in the same denomination, same church, there could be someone giving the opposite message. And so it doesn't seem we can find it we can say it tends to be in these denominations and not in those. It seems to be widely disseminated. Across the Christian faith, I'll just give a couple of quick examples. I've been a kind of devotee of St. Francis for decades. He to me represents so much of the kind of spirituality we need for the future. And I ended up being invited to be part of something here in the United States, of an attempt to renew the Franciscan movement here. Because what's happening in the Catholic Church is that the Franciscan movement is aging, and fewer priests, nuns, and friars are coming in, from younger ages. And so what's used to be over 160 Franciscan organizations in North America is now about 120, and it could soon be less and less. And so what a group of nuns have decided to do is to say, let's not just surrender to this, because the treasures of our Franciscan heritage are so great. And they are making some bold and creative decisions and commitments to try to envision the continuing of the Franciscan vision, the Franciscan set of values, whether or not their existing organizations continue in their current form. And it's this, the image that comes to my mind is, how salmon at the end of their life, when you think they're getting old, they're getting tired, they do their most creative act, which is to swim up the rivers and end their life in this fertilization of eggs and creation of the future generation. And so I think of an example like that is truly inspiring, full of so much potential. And then just in unlikely places, pastors of denominations that are so rigid and so nostalgic and so, I'll say it, just because of the times, I think I'll be blunt, so cowardly in the sense that they don't want to say anything that will upset their major donors. Here, we find pastors who are just saying, I'm going to risk everything, and I'm going to try to lead our congregation into a new relationship to the world and to the future. So it's just happening. It's happening among people who have dropped out, but they can't hide the fact that the Spirit of God has touched them and that the life and teaching of Jesus have inspired them. So they haven't been able to find a church where there's any place for them, but they've forming little connections and communities, some of them on Zoom, where they're spread around the world. And yet they're encouraging each other and welcoming this vision of the future.
Hmm. And do you find common features? Is there because you've written about doubt, and often doubt for Christians is actually a disappointment with the church and with other Christians. My sense is that when you identify communities of the kind you have, what they've got is an electric sense of God.
Yes.
Could you talk about common features in that spirit?
Yes. So, this most recent book I wrote, Faith After Doubt, I talk about people progressing through various stages of faith. And when you move from one stage to the other, doubt is the portal. You have to doubt your current stage to give you the motivation to seek something better. And I think what happens in the early stages is people are given a very rigid system of beliefs. And it's very understandable that their first thought is, how do I get an even better perfect system of beliefs? And people can go through that in decades. And I'm all for upgrading our beliefs. But eventually, I think what they realize is we're never going to have the perfect system of beliefs. And even if we did, we'd never be able to convince more than 3 other people to sign on to it. Maybe Christian faith is about a way of life rather than a system of beliefs. And they make a critical decision, and that is they aren't going to wait for people above them in the hierarchy, or they aren't going to wait for a majority of people to agree with them. They just say, I have no choice. I have to live into this future as I am. And in every situation, we have our own unique challenges. I mean, in my opinion, Pope Francis in the Catholic Church represents this. He ends up being the Pope, but if he weren't the Pope, you can be sure he would not just be a towing the line Catholic. He would be thinking in ways that he would have some very strong enemies, and he certainly does, including many of his own bishops are his strongest opponents. So from the Pope to a dear, almost like a family member for us, a woman who is a neighbor who doesn't have proper documentation and who my wife and I are very close to. And in her own humble way, she knows what's not working out there, and she's just trying to live it out in her very quiet life on the margins. So what they have in common is this commitment to not wait for anybody else, but to start living into that future now. I think very much in line with what this whole program really is about.
And there are some obviously painful things to face up to. In many ways, that the most painful is the widespread accounts of clerical sex abuse. I mean, it seems to me with that particular issue that there are 2 ways to look at it. You can say this is an example of huge moral failure, or you can say, how widespread does moral failure have to be before you wonder if there's poison at the very heart of the religion itself?
Yeah.
How do you deal with the weight of that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, if we were to go back 25 years before, the first reports of clergy abuse in Boston came out, there would have been rumors, but no one would have guessed that things were as bad as they are. And so in a certain sense, we just have to realize that knowing what we know now and knowing how serious it is, I think there are all kinds of mistakes we can make at a moment like this. We can minimize it, or we can try to blame one person for it, or come up with one simple, silver bullet that we think will fix the problem. But I do think there's a sense, just as you say in your question, where we have to say, now is the time for deep introspection, and to say, what is at the heart? Is there something that is deeply held in Christian faith in general that is perpetuating, that's making these kinds of problems systemic? And of course, many people are still struggling to understand the reality of systemic evil and systemic injustice. We're so used to putting all the blame on bad individuals. But when we start to pay attention to systems, we start to see that the solutions we need are to change conditions, not just to stigmatize people. And those conditions might be assumptions we have about who has authority, who has a direct pipeline to God, who has power, and how much power people can be trusted in without some sort of accountability. And then if I could add one other, one of the things that has been a learning for me in the last 10 years, 15 years, I used to think that there were Christian problems, but now I'm realizing there are human problems. And sometimes elements of the Christian faith help us address our problems, but sometimes they give our problems a booster shot. and so suddenly we realize we're dealing with realities of being human. And again, it comes back to this theme of a new future from God, because you go back to the New Testament, and Paul is constantly speaking of a new humanity in Christ, and the sense that there's a new way of being human that is opening up to us as a gift from God that we can walk into.
So one of the 4 C's of HeartEdge is congregational life, and clearly you yourself you've been a pastor, you've led a congregation, a growing congregation, and there seem to be a number of ways in which congregations grow. One is the what you might call the myth of the charismatic pastor,
Yes.
the remarkable, usually male, not always, pastor who just drips godliness, and the congregation eagerly open their mouths to receive it.
Yes.
Another is the perhaps not so much of a myth, about a much more rigorous form of lay training, where the leadership is dispersed across a wide group of people, and no one individual is. Could you talk about the sort of patterns, as again going back to that future emphasis?
Yes.
Of how we can imagine congregations having learned from the problems of the cult of personality, which is obviously still very much with us, but also the sort of fantasy of leaderless groups. As we explore the kind of weariness with how large groups of people can go seriously wrong. Could you share some of the insights that you've had about what the future shape of church might look like?
Well, to be really honest, I feel I know less about that now than I did 15 or 20 years ago. And the reason being that I think we're in this period of profound reorganization of all of human life. I mean, to make it at its most fundamental, the entire human species has to find a new way of living with the earth. I mean, what could be more fundamental than that? Maybe more fundamental, a new way of living with time and the reality of death, and living with the reality of future generations. All of these very basic things we're in the process of reorganizing, and I don't expect that to be a short-term process or a clean and neat process. I think it's going to. We're already seeing how messy it is, and it's going to last. The transition to whatever our new way of living is going to be, it's going to take a long time, and there's unavoidable stress between here and there. So I guess what that says to me is that we have to trust the long arc of God's work in the world. We have to trust in the longer picture, and let go of the idea that we're going to fix this, in time for the next annual meeting or something. And what that means is, if we accept that, just to give an example, if we could go back in time and all of us have a conversation with ourselves in January of 2020 and say, listen, in 2 months, there's going to be news of this pandemic, and here's how it's going to change your life. I mean, I don't know if any of us would have believed it. And if we've been told, and it's going to last a couple of years, we would think that's impossible. But what we've done is we've developed capacities for resilience, and we've developed the ability to adjust. We've proven to ourselves how adaptable we can be. And you put all that together and say, those are the practices we're going to need going forward. And that's I guess what I feel more than anything. It's not that maybe we will figure out some structural improvements that will solve some of these problems, but I have a feeling in the short run, it's the attitude of resilience and the ability to say, we might be in a rough patch for quite a long time. I think then we're able to draw from the resources of our faith, the ability to be resilient and persistent. That word endurance comes up so much in the New Testament, and suddenly you see there's a quality that that we're going to need in spades going forward.
I wonder if you could keep going in that theme, because as everybody studies when they go to seminary, the New Testament writers more often than not are expecting an end to the human story sooner rather than later. And you've talked about how that notion has been misused even up to the 21st century in the church. And yet, as that expectation isn't realized, gradually the significance of this worldly life increases.
Yes.
And what you're describing in describing what was once thought of as a nuclear winter and now is a kind of climate winter, climate exile, shall we say, to use a more scriptural term, is something that points to the significance of setback and hardship as being, in some ways, more significant in the way they open our eyes to who God is and how God works than times of plenty. It certainly seems to me to be the story of the exile in the Old Testament. And could you talk about how and yet there's that sort of that innate conviction that if God is on my side, it'll all turn up roses.
Yes.
And it's the whole. So what's at stake in what you're describing is the whole. What's the point of being a Christian? What is the church anyway? I mean, these are very fundamental things that are brought up by what you're saying.
Yes, it's really true. This is a little bit of a caricature, but I sometimes say the form of Christianity I was inducted into was an evacuation plan. The earth is doomed. Here's the escape pod to get to heaven. And one of the things that really changed my whole life was when I was a preacher and I started to realize that in the Lord's Prayer, we don't pray, our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. May we go to heaven as soon as possible where your kingdom is. But it's, may your will be done on earth. May your kingdom come on earth. So the sense that the gospel is actually a transformation plan. And it's about joining God and God's dreams and wishes and hopes for a desired future on earth. And, it's one of the things I think that becomes obvious when you study church history, and even if you live long enough to see it in your own lifetime, we love to project on the Bible the images that make us feel good. And so the promised land image is one that makes us feel good. If we can just get through this wilderness, we'll be in the promised land. But when I read the Bible, what I find is the promised land wasn't so great. They get to the promised land and it's better than slavery. And it's probably better than the wilderness. But you've got the Assyrians and the Egyptians and the Babylonians and the Philistines all trying to come and steal some of your milk and honey. So having a promised land isn't the best thing. So then they start imagining a promised time. And what's so interesting, especially this comes up in the book of Isaiah and the Hebrew scriptures, but in many of the other prophets, when they start dreaming of this promised time, it's no longer just about them. It's no longer just about Israel. They realize if Israel's going to have a good future, Egypt needs a good future, and the Philistines need a good future, and the Arameans need a good future, and the Assyrians need a good future. Everybody needs a good future, because otherwise we're going to be afraid that my neighbor's going to come and need to rob some of my milk and honey because he's starving. And so you start to see this vision expand from a promised land to a promised time. And that promised time, you don't get the feeling that it's all roses either. You realize that the promised time that you can envision at this moment is a breakthrough from our current problems. But in all likelihood, when we get to that breakthrough, there'll be some new problems to arise. And what that says to me is that we need a vision, not of struggle and then resolution, but a vision of continuing growth, continuing maturity, continuing evolution, if you will. Just one last comment in this regard. Years ago, someone encouraged me to read more about Gregory of Nyssa, one of the early church scholars. And Gregory of Nyssa got in trouble with his fellow clergy of his day because he didn't believe there was something called perfection. He said that perfection is infinite progression. And so he believed that every created thing is called to continual growth. And he didn't envision an arrival, but an ongoing growth. And I think he had an insight that we all need. Yeah.
Could I stick with that again and push you a bit further, because you said an intriguing thing, which is that when we get to the promised time, there's still going to be some obstacles to overcome. Could you say what you think heaven is? Because it clearly isn't, what you realized it was when you were growing up, which was the place you went to on the escape chute.
Yes.
But you've described it as a in a sense an ever receding form of fulfillment. But I mean, both in terms of where it is,
yes,
or when it is, perhaps to use your time language, and what we actually do when we're there.
yes. So first, let me say, and if folks disagree with me, feel free to disagree. What I'm about to say is, it might be unorthodox, I'm not sure, but I've come to believe that most of the New Testament, let me say it this way, very little of the New Testament is focused on the afterlife. I think when Jesus speaks of the kingdom of God, I don't think that means heaven after you die. I think when Jesus speaks of the kingdom of God, I think he's talking about a new way of living that involves God's will being done on earth as in heaven. And when I say God's will, I don't mean God's dominating, imposing tyrannical rule. I mean God's good desires, God's generous and loving desires for the earth. And so if we say there is something deeply wrong with the way human beings are living, my primary concern is how we can begin to heal that and live in a better way for ourselves, for the earth, for future generations. As for what happens when we die, if we're speaking of heaven as what happens to us when we die, I also feel like I understand less about that than I ever did before. But here's what I feel. I believe God is trustworthy. And I hope when I reach my last breath, that I'll feel as I do now. I say this for my own benefit, that I just feel God is trustworthy. And when I exhale my last exhalation, I hope I'm, in that sense, like as Jesus said, into God's hands I commend my spirit. Into God's hands I commend who and what I am. I trust God, and whatever happens is just fine with me. I think all of those images that the very material images we've been given of heaven, streets of gold, harps, thrones, all of that, that's just imagery. And the imagery is there to evoke certain things in us. And those things we evoke aren't because they're necessarily giving us an accurate understanding of what happens after life, but it's giving us motivation to live with that kind of resilience in this life. So, for example, someone like, Dr. King here in the US, or Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu in South Africa, or so many people through history who've known that they were risking their life, risking their livelihood to try to do what's right. They would be able to say, look, I'm trusting myself to God. And if I live a shorter life on this earth to do what's right, I'll gladly do that and trust myself to God afterwards. I don't feel I'll be wasting my life. I feel I'll be investing.
And eternity. Yeah, I mean, you referred to time. It
Yes,
that sense of being entrusted to God, but
yes,
it takes on a whole different dimension when you think that the span of our life is 80 years and 10.
yes,
But compared to eternity, it's not even a drop in the ocean. How do
yes.
you get your head around eternity?
I really don't think about it that much. I'm going to be honest with you. And the reason why is so many of our concepts of eternity, I'm now convinced, come to us from Greek philosophy. And they would not have been resident in the Jewish people at all. The Jewish people had virtually no interest or concern in the afterlife. Most still do not. And all through the Hebrew scriptures, there is no idea of going to heaven or hell after you die. Only if you read the King James Version that includes a bad translation of the Hebrew word Sheol. Um, there's this sense. So to me, death is this fact of life. It's this part of life. And it challenges me to take this life even more seriously. So rather than saying these 70 years are a drop in the bucket, to me, I think the fact that death is real means that when I woke up this morning and I had the chance to be with you all for this time, to realize what a gift this is. This is an irreplaceable day. As the Psalm said, this is the day the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. And if I've in the last several years, I've walked both of my parents up to the doorway of death and been their primary caretaker as they died. And some of us through illness or injury or just old age, we get to the point where we think, I've had enough of life. There's so much pain day after day after day. Again, at that point, we're ready to say, I trust myself to God. I've had my turn here, and whatever's next, I'm ready for it. And we have that confidence.
Can we take things in a slightly different direction now? And clearly through the pandemic, we've talked about climate change. But one of the other biggest themes of the last 19 months has been race.
Yes.
And it seemed like just as the whole world was was two things. Was stiller than it had been for a long, long time. But also it it was asking questions about change and how
Yes.
the world was going to be different after the pandemic. Then the George Floyd murder raised up a whole host of unresolved issues.
Yes.
And we both come from a certain social location,
Yeah.
and so much of the discourse, I mean, obviously in many circles prior to last May, but certainly very much the discourse, the mainstream discourse since last May has been pointing out how the story of the world and the story of people's flourishing looks so profoundly different,
Yes.
depending on where they're coming from, where they're
Yes.
located. Could you talk about how you navigate some of those things? Because there are some voices that are quite adversarial, that talk in terms of almost a kind of a tension stroke battle that is going to go on indefinitely and is not resolvable. Others more conciliatory, more harmonious in their vision and outlook. Where would you locate yourself in relation to those kind of
Yes.
expressions?
I this is such. Well, of course, you all understand. For someone in the United States, we have our own peculiar relation to any discussion of race. Now, I think for folks in the United Kingdom, you also have your issues to deal with in this, but they're quite different from ours. But they have common roots. And these common roots, I think, go back, they go back very, very far. But if you wanted a key date in my mind that relatively few Christians are aware of, it would be not 1492, but 1452. And in the 1450s, the Pope was asked, he sent out a letter first to the King of Portugal, and then it went to the King and Queen of Spain, and then it went to the King of France, and spread, and to a number of other kings. But it was a document that now is known as the Doctrine of Discovery. And if any of you wanted to do a little research after we get off this call, I'd encourage you to just Google Doctrine of Discovery. You can read it. It's a relatively short, it's a series of documents, but the original one that was sent to the King of Portugal you can read it in 5 minutes. And it basically gives permission to all the Christian kings of Europe to go into all the world and make slaves of all nations, and steal all of their property and steal all of their wealth. If they become Christians, then you'll have one relationship with them. And if they do not become Christians, you have permission to do whatever you need to do to expropriate their wealth, including killing them and enslaving them. So this document goes out from the Pope in 1452. And what unfolds that we know as the history of colonialism flows from this. And they're sent out in the name of Christianity. But here's the problem. If most of the Christians who are listening to the Pope are white Europeans, Christian supremacy becomes a cover for white supremacy. And this is so deeply rooted in white Christian history that I think one of the things that's happened over this pandemic, and with George Floyd, and I live in Florida, you might remember there was a fellow named Trayvon Martin who lived not too far from here, from where I live. This exposure of the ongoing effects of white supremacy in our culture and rooted in the Christian faith, I just think we have a very, very big challenge now to deal with them decisively. What did James Baldwin say? Not everything that is faced can be overcome, but nothing can be overcome that is not faced, something like that. And so now is our opportunity to face these things. And, you know, I used to be afraid, Sam, that the Christian church would die because it wasn't willing to change. And now I'm more worried that it will survive without changing the things that need to be changed, and that even more harm and damage could be done in the future. And I say that as someone, I was part of the clergy witness in Charlottesville, Virginia in 2017. So I was there in the events of that day. There's something, so I'm so glad you bring this up, because to me, we can talk about a pandemic, a virus, COVID-19, but we're having to face some of the spiritual viruses that are embedded in our culture and that are passed on from generation to generation. Interestingly, by breath, not by a virus, but by words and attitudes that are conveyed and passed on. And so the virus goes on generation after generation.
And ways forward, I mean, multiracial congregations, reparations. I mean, you know, there are many different strands of how people propose to come out of this stuckness. So
let me try to respond to that first, honestly, by saying I think it's all of the above. I think we have to understand this is such a deep-seated problem. And by the way, we've only just described the Christian version of it in the West. But if we were in India, you know, the caste system has certain similarities. And if we were in Rwanda and Burundi, the relationship between the Tutsi and the Hutu we see, you know, similar patterns. And of course, Christianity influenced some of those for the worse. And so around the world, this is a human problem, that some people like to gain power over others. And they like to gain, they like to get their own gains, even at the expense of others. And this is where the basic teaching of Jesus is so challenging us to say, love your neighbor, not beneath yourself, but as yourself. So everything you'd want for yourself, you want for your neighbor. This deeply Christian, paradigm shift is what we need. But here's a way to say it. If I were to go to my Jewish friends and say to them, what do you wish we Christians would do about anti-Semitism? And I were to say, really help me. I want and say, if you don't want to talk to me about it, recommend some books I can read. So in other words, instead of starting with our own thinking, I'd like to start with the thinking of the people who are experiencing the harm done by some of our Christian practices. I imagine doing that with my Jewish brothers and sisters, and I've been involved in these kinds of dialogues with Jewish leaders for a couple of decades now. I imagine going to my Muslim neighbors and saying, what do you Muslims, knowing what you've seen of our relationship over many centuries, what do you wish we would do to improve our relationship? And we were to take that seriously. Well, I think we have to do something very similar in the issue of race. Instead of thinking, what do we think we should do? We should really listen to what our Black, if we're white, what our Black and brown Asian brothers and sisters want to say to us. And if we listen, the act of listening, I think, is one of the changes that's needed so much. You see, instead of us running off to solve it without the relationship. One quick story. I was privileged. I can't tell you what an honor this was for me. I have some Native American friends who were going to be part of this conference that was only Native Americans. And I was invited to, they brought me along. And one of the Native American speakers went up to the microphone. I think maybe 300 people there. And he said, what white people don't understand is that we only have to demand reparations because there is no relationship. If they were willing to have a relationship, we would have an entirely different discussion. And that to me just goes to the heart of the matter. When people have given up on being in a relationship of respect and neighborliness, then it's a whole different discussion. And maybe we will never be able to get to that place, but my moral summons as a Christian says that's where we have to go. We have to try to build those relationships. And what that means for all of us, especially who are in a position of privilege, it means that we have to go prepared to not be respected, to be prepared to not be trusted. We have to be prepared to have people be suspicious of us because they have a long-standing reason to be. And so much more we could say about that. But I just think that listening and entering into a relationship, there's no shortcut around that. And I would say in churches, what that means is, in fact, I say this jokingly, it sounds like a joke, but I mean it seriously. I feel we should give all of our religious leaders a promotion so that our archbishops and popes and, presiding bishops should all become interfaith ambassadors. Their main job is to build relationships with other faiths and then let everybody else move up and fill in the gaps, because we need our leaders to be leading, and then all of us can follow in building those relationships.
So I'm going to nudge you in perhaps a more provocative direction, where I'm guessing what you're going to say, but I would just want to tease out where you'd like to take it. And that is this word supremacy.
Yes.
Is it fair to say that a religion, as you've characterized it, that has for most of its history been predicated on ensuring the eternal security, well-being, and happiness of a percentage of the world's population, as its raison d'etre? I mean, that Jesus came so that some of us can go upstairs in luxury harps and so on forever.
Yes.
Is supremacist to the core of its being, that the whole point of being a Christian for much of church history is not only that we get a guarantee of milk and honey forever, but that we get to despise and look down on those less worthy than us who go downstairs, and that we, in some ways, assign to ourselves the right to classify people about whether they come upstairs with us or go to outer darkness. Do you see what I mean? I want to take
Yes,
the
yes, yes.
disentangling issue. You've taken it
Yes.
as far as the historical complicity of the church, but
Yes.
I wonder about the doctrinal
Yes.
complicity of the faith.
Yes, I think you have captured the heart of the issue. And I would say that that aspect of the Christian religion is, I want to say two things. I have to say both of them. It's evil and it's un-Christ-like, but it's deeply embedded in our religion. I think the whole thrust of Jesus's life, it goes in the opposite direction. I think the thrust of Paul's life goes in the opposite direction. But our religion recast so much of what they said to be the kind of supremacist narrative you've described. And you might say, well, if you think that, Brian, why do you stay a Christian? Well, I wouldn't if I didn't believe that Jesus was actually offering an alternative to that. And that in many ways, all through history, our greatest saints provided an alternative to that. You think of St. Francis having the courage to go into the Sultan of Egypt's camp during the Crusades, not to proclaim supremacy and to threaten his life, but to go and say, hey, we have to meet one another in peace. We have to, my following of Jesus calls me to live in peace. How can we live in peace? To say that that's the voices that we need to hear going forward. And what that's going to require in Christians is a radical, I'm going to use a familiar word to us, a radical reformation in our theology. To say our theology got it wrong in many, many ways. And one of the most serious is the idea, well, here's how a British missiologist said it. No, I don't think anyone has said it more succinctly than he. Leslie Newbigin said, the greatest heresy in the history of monotheism is a misunderstanding of election. Election meaning the idea of being chosen by God. He said, we have taught that election is for privilege when election is for service. You're not chosen to get benefits and prizes and cake. You're chosen to go be a servant of all. And I mean, that's an easy sentence to say, but if we were to take Newbigin's brilliant insight and radical insight and really let it work on us, I think it would take us just where we need to go.
And so your vision then is for radical communities of humble repentance, reconciliation, and service.
Yes.
Who pays the bills for those communities?
Yes. Well, this is one of our challenges going forward because the people who care are going to have to pay the bills. And what we've ended up doing is incurring such big bills that we can't tell the people what we really need to be about. So we basically give them what they pay for. And if what they're paying for is good organ music and words that never challenge us to face the racism and the environmental destruction and all the rest, then we pay for that and we get it. But I think we're reaching a point where we have to say, we're in a sense, reality is doing this for us, because as generations say, this religion as it currently stands is not worth my investment, then that stream of money is going to decrease. And so one way or another, change is ahead for us. And this, to me, provides an opportunity for a more healing vision of what the Christian faith can be to emerge. But one of the great challenges, to return to something we said before, is all of us are to some degree waiting for someone else to fix this. And I think all of us have to say, nobody else is going to fix this for us. We all have to fix it together. And maybe this, going back to your comment earlier about the charismatic personality comes in and solves everything. I think we have to say a little bit, well, echoing Moses when he said, I wish all the Lord's people were prophets. All of us are going to have to step into that role in our own way. And that includes being generous to the congregations and communities that are trying to lead in this new direction.
So that puts us in a very different position to very different position in society in relation to the status quo, because for again, the majority of the church's history, being a Christian and being a good citizen were more or less synonymous.
Yes.
And what you're portraying is a much more marginalized, a much less affirmed, a much less status-based kind of Christianity, which of course sounds great, but isn't popular.
Yes, and here's where it's so interesting. Like, in one sense, yeah, Jesus wasn't popular, he got killed. But thousands and thousands of people would spend a day sitting on a hillside to get a chance to listen to him. And St. Francis didn't live a life of comfort, but he had people all around who started hearing about him and saying what he's doing is significant. 100 years before St. Francis, or a generation before St. Francis, Hildegard von Bingen just started. I mean, she did all kinds of things that women weren't allowed to do, and she found a way to do them. And people all around would hear about it. And so I think it doesn't take much. A little light can shine brightly, and that's what I think. That's what I think is already happening. But I think it could happen. I think it could happen much more. And I should also say, I think people's skepticism about good things coming from the Christian faith is warranted. They have reasons to be skeptical, which means we ought to expect we have to do the right thing for a long time before we should expect people to notice, because we've got an awful lot of negative history that's gotten the headlines for a long time.
Well, Claire has asked us to finish with Julian's words, "All shall be well," written, as she points out, during the time of the Black Death. Yeah. What do those words say to you? We've talked about a lot of the sadder parts of the Christian faith today, and the need for reformation, as you've used that word. If we were to finish with Julian's words, all shall be well, which I guess bring us back to that eschatological theme that we started with, what would be your word to those who are on the call tonight?
Yes. Well, what comes to mind is what we might say to a young parent who has a few little children, and one of them has just made a mess, and the other one is throwing up on the floor, and the other one is screaming and crying because his brother took his toy, and it just seems like total chaos. And at that moment, the parent could think, I must be a terrible parent. My children are crying and they're unhappy and they're grumpy. And what we want to say is, no, this is just part of life. And these are wonderful children, and better days will come. All shall be well. You'll get through this rough night. And the joys of parenthood, the costs of parenthood are great, but the joys of parenthood are so great as well. And this is life. And the love that you have for your children at this moment is part of the beauty of this moment. And the fact that at their worst, you still love them. God is real in that. And I think when we can see it in that way, in the mess and difficulty of life, these are opportunities for love to flow, and forgiveness to flow, and resilience to flow, and creativity to flow. Those are all good things. And so all shall be well might not mean all shall be easy, but I think it shall mean, in this very sense of, on that first creation day, we can say it's good. It's very good.
Well, I think what we've discovered is that life around Brian McLaren isn't easy, but it's good. And thank you, Brian, for your inspiring vision, your very healthy and timely challenge, but your very creative and inspiring opening out of the renewed possibilities of the Christian faith and even the church, much maligned as it is, as a source of hope for the world. Thanks everyone for joining the call. This is the last of our Thursday night conversations. It's by no means the end of Living God's Future now, and certainly not the end of HeartEdge. I'd like to believe that everything that Brian has been describing is what HeartEdge stands for, and the conversations that are stimulated by this kind of an evening are everything that HeartEdge is talking about in its renewal of the church through commerce, culture, compassion, and congregational life. So please do get involved with HeartEdge in all the ways that you've seen in the chat, and please join me in thanking Brian for his incredibly generous and inspiring thoughts tonight. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks for your great